All right, joining us next on the show today, he's a retired Army colonel, one of our favorite guests. He's giving us the inside scoop on all things geopolitics. Colonel Douglas Macgregor, thanks for joining us on Steak for Breakfast.
Sure, happy to be here.
Always a pleasure hosting, sir. Well, I've noticed a little bit, Ukraine hasn't been being talked about in the news as much lately because actual reports from, close to the ground and the front lines are saying that the Ukrainians are continuing to incur big losses in places like Bakhmut, and things that you told us about virtually months ago are seeming to come to fruition right now. We've also heard reports that, even though we've given so much and the world has given so much ammunitions and things of that nature to Ukraine, they're running out of them as well. And for a war that they should be virtually winning on every level, according to the mainstream media, it doesn't seem to necessarily be the case.
Gee, you haven't left me anything to say. I think the lesson is that you can suppress the truth only so long, and ultimately the battlefield will reveal the truth, and that's what we're hearing. We're over 300,000 dead Ukrainian soldiers. That's not including the civilians that are probably killed and wounded as a result of the fighting. The Ukrainians have lost roughly 10,000 armored fighting vehicles, including self-propelled guns and tanks and other kinds of equipment. And we've lost, at least to this point, at least $70 billion of the $118 billion allocated for Ukraine. And I don't know how many Americans, Germans, Frenchmen, Brits in NATO uniform who've been operating in Ukrainian staffs and organizations have been killed. We won't know that for a long time, but I'm sure we've had several casualties. But the bottom line is the whole thing is falling apart. And I don't know where they're going to get a counterattack from, especially after the last 48 hours. The Russians destroyed 9 Ukrainian brigade headquarters, 200 tons of ammunition, and wiped out a substantial portion of whatever remained of Ukraine's air defense network. So once the mud dries, right now, if you're in Ukraine and you step off the road, you sink up to your waist or chest in mud. Oof. If you're in a tank or an armored fighting vehicle, you sink, nothing moves. But I suppose once that finally dries out, and we still have rain at the moment in Ukraine, the Russians will come out and walk over the remaining dead and march further west.
Where do you see an end game for Russia in this? Obviously, we know at some point they'll get to the negotiation table. They'll try to make it, put lipstick on a pig as best as possible. Ukraine will still be winning for all things Western democracy-wise, and even though Russia is still going to get their historically old geographical territories, they're taking the biggest loss in the history, since World War II. And once that happens, what is the reality of how this area is going to be reshaped? Especially, you had the NATO chief in the last 2 weeks make his first trip to Kiev since the conflict started and said it doesn't matter if all the NATO members want it or not. The rest of the world wants Ukraine to be in NATO, so that's pretty much the end game for them.
Yeah, I like my favorite expression is put a happy face on the dead rat. Mm-hmm. And right now, the policy of waging war at the expense of the Ukrainian nation against Russia hasn't worked. It's failed miserably. How will this end? Well, it'll end when the Russians decide to end it. I think what they've been waiting for is they know we won't talk to them, and that anything we say is going to be treated with extreme suspicion. Remember, we're the ones that urged them to join the Minsk talks and agreements. We promised them that we would deliver on equality before the law for the millions of Russians living in Ukraine and speaking Russian, that effectively the Russians would ultimately end up in a situation where Ukraine would not represent a threat to them. The opposite has happened, so they're not going to talk to us. But I think they've been waiting to see governments in Europe turn over, and I think that's coming. I think if you look at what's happening in France right now with Macron, I wouldn't give a plug nickel for Macron in another month. I'd be surprised if he's still there. The British they'll lose the current prime minister and find something new, and they'll go through governments until that economy collapses. Yep. The real question is what happens in Berlin with Scholz, who is probably the most uninteresting, unimaginative, and unimpressive leader Germany has had, certainly in the last 1,000 years that I can recollect. So they may be willing to talk to the Europeans. Now, what do the Russians want? Well, they want a Ukraine that's not a threat to Russia. just as we would like a Mexico that's not a threat to us.
Correct.
I don't know how they'll get it without marching all the way to the Polish border. And I think increasingly in Moscow, that's what people are talking about. They don't want to, because I don't think the Russians want to govern real Ukrainians. And the majority of real Ukrainians, those that are left, are west of the river.
Right. Most
of the people east of the river, of the Dnieper, are Russified, as they say. In other words, they speak Russian. Culturally, they're Russian. And if you looked at the electoral maps for years, they were quite willing to join Russia. So the bottom line is, what do they do about the people in the West? They'd like them to be neutral. Who's going to guarantee that? We're certainly not going to guarantee it. So it's up to the countries that border Russia, and primarily Germany and France, to sign on for something that guarantees that the neutrality of this sort of rump Ukrainian state. But there's another problem, and this is one that you hinted at when you asked your question. What happens to Ukraine? I mean, we know that Larry Fink at BlackRock and his friends all thought that they were going to cash in big time, buy up everything that was left in Ukraine, and exploit the region and the population forever. That's not going to happen now. It looks like Xi has offered to help rebuild the place, provided Zelensky will come to terms with the Russians. But Zelensky can't really do that without probably being hanged himself for doing so. He certainly can't do it without our support. There are probably 18 million people left in Ukraine at this point. There were originally 30.5 million, 34.5 million. And if you go back to the early 1990s, there were over 80 million people living in the place.
Right.
So there's not much of Ukraine left. It's in ruins. Its population is left, and everybody coming out of the place insists they'll never go back. Mm-hmm. So we've destroyed Ukraine. Well done, Washington. While the rest of Europe looks on. And, oh, by the way, don't worry about Ukraine anymore, because it's time to prepare for war with China.
That is the next thing I wanted to segue on. It seems like, as you know, people at the highest levels of our government and all of the big lobbyists in the military industrial complex seem to get tired with this new shiny thing. You know, Zelensky's not going to be making any trips back to Congress to drape Ukrainian flags over the speaker's lectern and things like that. I've actually seen a couple editorials over the course of the last few weeks that, you know, if Zelensky doesn't play his card right and get in line by the summer, there's people who saying that he could be subject to his own, you know, U.S.-induced coup like they did back in 2014 when the group that would eventually come in and take power that led to his rise came in there. So now we're seeing all the Sunday morning talk shows this week said, oh, guess what? Now we need to prepare for war with China. There wasn't really any new developments. China does what they kind of do. Their military drills, they're testing missiles and rockets and equipment and stuff like that. They buzz the towers off the coast of Taiwan, and didn't really seem like anything big. And the last time you were here, you kind of laid it out really nicely, saying how there are people who see both sides of the coin in China and Taiwan. There's more backroom talks between those two nations probably than with the United States. But now it seems like the West just wants to stoke the flames to distract everybody's attention to their last failed war to a potentially new one. What can you tell us about that?
Well, as I think we were talking earlier, if you've failed to win a single war in decades, what's the problem with adding yet another potentially failed war to the list? So I guess that's the justification or rationale for adding China. Look, the people in Washington want to keep the money flowing. Anything that threatens to stop the money from flowing. And I'm talking about money for everything you can think of, whether it's for entitlement programs or it's military programs. And remember, as long as you have forces spread all over the world, that's an enormous justification for spending. I mean, it costs us enormous quantities of money to maintain forces at sea, forces in Europe, forces in Asia, forces in Africa, forces in the Caribbean. All of these things must continue to sustain this enormous overhead of wasteful bureaucracy and politicians that we've created in D.C.
Right.
So clearly that's a big part of it. But I think Americans need to understand there's really no evidence whatsoever for any aggressive action on the ground or at sea by the Chinese military against us. Certainly nothing planned to go after Taiwan. That's absurd. And if you know anything about Taiwan, most of the island is mountainous.
Yep.
And there are only maybe one or two beaches where you can comfortably land. This place is still 100 miles of water away from China. The last thing the Chinese need right now is a war. 1 out of every Chinese male under the age of 30 and over the age of 18 is out of work. Xi can't produce enough employment. The shadow banking structure has been largely erased, so credit is drying up in China. The expansion is over. That's why Xi has been concentrating power, not to deal with us, although he has to defend against us in his mind. His biggest problem is inside China. Look, you got 1.4 billion people. Michael Faber likes to say there are, 4 or 5 versions of the United States inside China.
Yeah.
Every morning, Xi wakes up, and what's his principal nightmare? Dynastic change, that he'll be overthrown internally by hundreds of millions of starving, unhappy people. That's what he worries about. So he's worried about feeding everybody, protecting everybody, and housing everybody. That's a tough job when you got 1.4 billion people. I don't think he's got much time left over for anything else.
No, and there were definitely talks earlier in the spring before his re-election. There was some dissent and unhappiness within the government of China towards his leadership when it came to taking care of things domestically instead of, extending the tentacles of the CCP throughout the course of the world. Colonel, last thing I wanted to ask you, we haven't touched on it too much with you, domestic politics here. Does anybody in the 2024 general election cycle that's running right now, especially in the Republican primary, when it comes to their foreign policy, have something that, brings to the table ideals that's going to, kind of get this war footing that we've fallen back into under the Biden administration back on track?
Other than Donald Trump, no. Donald Trump has taken the same position he did while he was president. He just didn't have much success in implementing any of it. And that is that we don't need to be everyone else's first responder. We do not need to police the globe. We need, first and foremost, to protect the United States. That means its borders, its population. He wanted to do what Xi is trying to do with great difficulty. That is protect us, house us, provide a decent standard of living, employment, and so forth for the American people. Now, when you look at DeSantis, I listened to him a few months ago, and he made the statement, much to my surprise, that we had no vital strategic interest in Ukraine that justified the presence of any U.S. forces under any circumstances. And then within a few days, he reappeared and said, I was wrong. We absolutely have to be there. So obviously, he's a man of extraordinary backbone and character. And immediately surrendered whatever autonomy or independence he had to the big donors who said, no, got to be at war. Nikki Haley is probably just a little bit to the right of Hillary Clinton, but not enough to make much difference.
Yeah.
So what have you got on the so-called Republican side? I don't see anything. And then, of course, we have the stalwart president himself, Joe Biden, who was declaring victory the other night because Tucker Carlson had been removed from Fox News.
Right.
So much for the First Amendment and free speech in America.
Wild times we're living in, Colonel. Listen, we're going to want to direct everybody that's not already tracking you and enjoys hearing you on our show to find you. Where can we find your website? And we'll live link it in the show description today.
All you have to do is go to douglasmcgregor.com or just plug in Colonel Douglas Macgregor. You'll come to my website. Everything I've ever written or said or done, I think, is probably there. And of course, YouTube. YouTube has got lots of different videos. Only a fraction of them are actually produced by me. Most of them are by other people who have picked it up. So there's no shortage of that. The problem is that now with Tucker gone, I don't think any of the major stations are going to carry anything I say or anybody like me. That's the tragedy.
Yeah.
And the American people deserve the truth. They've got to have the truth. And the only way they're going to get it is to demand it. They've got to look for it, but they've got to demand it. Somebody said the truth will set you free. Well, until we have the truth, we're not free in this country anymore.
You hit the nail right on the head there, Colonel. And like I said, you've always got a landing pad here on Steak for Breakfast where we propriate telling the truth on a bi-weekly basis now. This is retired Army Colonel, one of our great friends. Love when he joins us on the show. Douglas Macgregor, thanks for coming down today.
Thanks, guys.